Imagine working harder every year, gaining experience, maybe even getting a raise. Yet somehow life still feels more expensive than it used to. Rent costs more, groceries cost more, transportation costs more, and the amount of money left at the end of the month feels smaller than it did before. For millions of people around the world, this experience has become surprisingly common. Salaries increase slowly, but the cost of living seems to move faster. Economists call this the problem of real wages, which means wages adjusted for inflation. When wages rise, but prices rise even faster, the purchasing power of income actually falls. In other words, a worker may technically earn more money, yet that money buys less than it did before. Data from international economic organizations shows that this phenomenon has affected many advanced economies during recent years. Across many OECD countries, wage growth has often struggled to keep pace with rising prices, which reduces the real purchasing power of workers despite nominal pay increases. This creates a strange situation where people feel like they're moving forward financially, yet their standard of living barely improves. At first glance, the explanation seems simple. Many people assume companies simply refuse to raise salaries enough, or that governments fail to control inflation. But the real story behind slow wage growth is much deeper and far more structural than it appears. To understand why salaries often struggle to keep up with living costs, we need to examine how modern economies distribute income, how productivity affects wages, and how inflation quietly reshapes purchasing power over time. The relationship between wages and the economy has always been closely connected to productivity, which measures how much value workers produce. In theory, when workers become more productive, businesses generate more revenue and can afford to pay higher wages. For much of the 20th century, this relationship worked relatively well. As productivity increased through industrialization, technology, and economic expansion, wages in many countries rose alongside economic growth. Workers became more efficient, companies produced more goods, and income levels improved steadily across large portions of society. However, during the past several decades, economists began noticing an unusual shift in this relationship. Productivity in many economies continued rising, meaning workers were still producing more value than before, yet wage growth began slowing compared to earlier decades. Research analyzing the productivity pay gap shows that the connection between productivity growth and wage growth has weakened in several developed economies over the last 40 years. This gap suggests that the economic gains created by productivity improvements are not always distributed evenly through wages. Instead, portions of that growth may flow toward profits, investment returns, or other parts of the economic system, rather than directly increasing worker salaries. Another factor affecting wages is inflation, which gradually raises the prices of goods and services across an economy. Inflation itself is not necessarily harmful when it remains moderate, because it often reflects growing economic activity and increasing demand. However, when prices rise faster than wages, workers experience a decline in purchasing power. This is exactly what happened in many economies during the recent inflation surge following global supply disruptions and energy price shocks. In many OECD countries, nominal wages increased during this period, but inflation rose even faster, causing real wages to decline temporarily. For workers, this meant that although their paychecks became slightly larger, the cost of everyday expenses increased even more quickly. Groceries, housing, transportation, and energy costs climbed, reducing the amount of goods and services those wages could actually purchase. Over time, this pattern creates the feeling that salaries never truly catch up with living costs. Even when wages eventually rise again, they are often catching up to past inflation, rather than improving purchasing power significantly. The situation becomes even more complex when we consider the global economy. Modern companies operate across international markets where competition, automation, and technological change influence labor costs. Businesses constantly attempt to balance wages with productivity, investment, and global competition. If wages increase too quickly relative to productivity, companies may face higher costs that reduce competitiveness or profitability. As a result, wage growth often moves cautiously rather than rapidly. Governments also influence wage dynamics through policies such as minimum wages, labor regulations, and economic stimulus programs. During periods of strong economic growth, wages may rise more quickly as companies compete for workers. During slower economic periods, wage growth tends to moderate as businesses attempt to control costs. According to international economic forecasts, global economic growth itself has slowed slightly in recent years compared to historical averages, which can also reduce the pace of wage increases. When economic expansion slows, businesses become more cautious about raising salaries, even if living costs continue rising due to inflation or supply constraints. All of these forces interact to create the complicated wage dynamics people experience today. Salaries do increase over time, but they often struggle to keep up with a combination of inflation, global competition, and structural economic changes that influence how income is distributed throughout modern economies. The surprising part is that wages do not only depend on how hard people work or how profitable companies become, they are also shaped by forces that workers rarely see directly. One of those forces is how inflation interacts with wage negotiations over time. In many economies, salaries are adjusted slowly, often once a year, while prices can change every month. This means inflation can move faster than wage agreements, creating a gap where workers temporarily lose purchasing power even before new salary adjustments are discussed. According to labor market studies, inflation shocks often hit workers immediately through rising household costs, while wage adjustments lag behind, because businesses wait to evaluate economic conditions before committing to higher payroll expenses. This delay creates a pattern where workers constantly feel behind, even when salary increases eventually arrive. A second force shaping wages is labor supply. When many workers are available for the same type of job, employers gain more bargaining power because replacing one worker becomes easier. But when skilled labor becomes scarce, wages tend to rise faster because businesses compete for talent. This explains why some sectors experience rapid salary growth while others remain relatively stagnant for years. Technology has made this imbalance even more visible. Automation and software have increased efficiency in many industries, but they have also reduced demand for certain types of routine work. Jobs that can be standardized often face slower wage growth because machines, software, or global outsourcing create alternatives to expensive labor. Meanwhile, highly specialized work often commands stronger wage growth because expertise remains difficult to replace. This divide creates the impression that salaries overall are rising slowly, while certain professions move much faster than others. Another major factor is that modern businesses no longer think only at the national level. Large companies compare labor costs across regions and countries, which means wage decisions are often influenced by global competition rather than local conditions alone. A company producing goods in one country may compare wage costs with factories in another region before deciding how much payroll can increase. This does not always reduce salaries directly, but it slows wage growth because businesses try to remain competitive internationally. The result is that workers in many countries are no longer negotiating only within their local economy. They are indirectly affected by labor markets across the world. Housing costs add another layer to the problem. In many countries, housing prices and rents have grown faster than wages for years, especially in urban centers where jobs are concentrated. This means even if salaries rise moderately, one major expense can absorb most of the increase before workers feel any improvement in daily life. Economic reports repeatedly show that housing affordability has become one of the strongest pressures on real household income in both developed and emerging economies. When rent consumes a growing share of salary, wage increases feel smaller than they appear on paper. Transportation and food costs then add additional pressure, especially during periods of supply disruption or energy price increases. Energy itself influences almost everything in an economy because transport, manufacturing, and food production all depend on it. When energy becomes more expensive, prices spread across multiple sectors, affecting household budgets far beyond fuel bills alone. Wages, however, do not automatically rise at the same speed because businesses face those same higher costs and often become cautious about payroll expansion. This creates a cycle where inflation spreads broadly while salary adjustments remain selective and delayed. Productivity also deserves deeper attention because it explains why many workers feel confused when economies grow, but salaries do not rise equally. In theory, if workers produce more output per hour, wages should reflect that value. Yet over recent decades, productivity gains have often been absorbed differently depending on the economic structure of each country. Some gains are reinvested into technology, some increase company profits, and some support shareholders rather than directly appearing in payroll. This does not mean wages never rise, but it means productivity growth alone no longer guarantees that salaries increase at the same speed as overall economic expansion. Labor economists have repeatedly noted that wage growth depends not only on productivity, but also on bargaining systems, labor market institutions, and how economic gains are distributed across sectors. Taxation and public policy also quietly influence how salaries feel in everyday life. A worker may receive a nominal raise, but tax changes, social contributions, and rising living costs can reduce how much additional money actually remains available for spending. In some cases, governments attempt to offset this through tax relief, subsidies, or minimum wage adjustments, but these policies vary widely between countries and often respond more slowly than inflation itself. This is why two workers earning similar salaries in different countries may experience completely different standards of living depending on taxes, public services, and housing markets. Another reason salaries feel permanently behind is psychological comparison. People often measure income not only against past years, but against visible prices around them. A salary increase of 5% may sound positive until rent rises by 8%, groceries by 10%, and transportation by 7%. Even if total inflation averages lower, the categories people notice most frequently shape how income feels emotionally. This means salary satisfaction depends heavily on which costs rise fastest in daily life. If the most visible household expenses rise sharply, people feel poor even when overall wage data appears stable. Central banks influence this indirectly through interest rate policy. When inflation rises too quickly, central banks raise interest rates to slow demand and stabilize prices. But higher interest rates also make borrowing more expensive for businesses, which can reduce hiring and slow salary growth. In trying to control inflation, monetary policy can therefore temporarily reduce wage momentum as well. This creates another difficult balance inside the economy. Controlling prices may protect long-term purchasing power, but in the short term, it can slow wage growth further. All of these forces together explain why salary growth often feels slower than expected, even when economies continue functioning and companies remain profitable. Wages are shaped by inflation timing, labor supply, housing costs, productivity distribution, global competition, taxation, and monetary policy all at once. For workers, the result feels simple. Income rises, but life rarely becomes easier as quickly as expected. Yet beneath that simple feeling lies an economic structure far more complex than a single paycheck suggests. What makes this even more surprising is that salary growth is often strongest at the exact moment when workers feel least secure about the economy. During periods when labor markets become unusually tight and companies struggle to find workers, wages can rise more quickly because employers compete harder to attract employees. This happened in several economies after major labor disruptions, where shortages in transportation, logistics, health services, and technical sectors pushed wages upward faster than normal. But even then, many households still felt financially pressured because inflation had already raised everyday expenses before wage growth accelerated. In practical terms, workers were not experiencing pure income growth. They were recovering purchasing power that had already been weakened. This is one reason salary increases often feel less satisfying than expected. A raise may look meaningful in percentage terms, yet much of it is absorbed by prices that have already moved ahead. Economic data from recent years repeatedly showed that even where nominal wages accelerated, real wage recovery remained uneven because inflation had first reduced household purchasing power over multiple quarters. Another hidden reason salaries struggle to catch up lies in the way businesses calculate future risk. Employers do not decide salaries only by looking at present profits. They also think about what might happen next year, whether demand will remain stable, whether interest rates will rise further, whether consumers will reduce spending, and whether global supply chains might create new costs. Because salaries are recurring obligations, businesses often increase wages carefully rather than aggressively. A machine can be purchased once, software can be upgraded periodically, but payroll continues every month regardless of whether revenue remains strong. This makes employers cautious even when profits appear healthy. In uncertain economic periods, companies often prefer bonuses, temporary incentives, or limited salary adjustments instead of large permanent wage increases. This caution becomes even stronger when borrowing costs rise. If interest rates increase, companies that rely on loans for expansion, equipment, or operations face higher financing costs. That pressure can slow hiring, reduce expansion plans, and weaken wage momentum even when demand still exists. At the same time, large corporations often have another advantage that smaller businesses do not: scale. Big firms can absorb cost increases more efficiently, automate certain processes faster, and spread expenses across larger operations, while smaller firms often struggle to match salary increases because their margins are thinner. This creates uneven wage growth even within the same economy. Workers in one sector may receive stronger raises, while others see little movement despite facing the same inflation outside work. Another important part of the story is that wages today are no longer shaped only by local productivity, but by how value moves through supply chains. A worker may help create a product that generates significant global revenue, yet only one small part of that final value returns as salary because profits are distributed across logistics, branding, technology, finance, and shareholders. This means economic growth can appear strong at the macro level while workers experience slower direct income gains. Productivity has increased dramatically in many sectors through digital systems, software, and process optimization, yet the benefits of that efficiency are often distributed across many layers of the economic system rather than flowing directly into paychecks. Economists studying labor markets often describe this as a change in how value is allocated inside modern economies. The wage share of national income in some countries has shifted compared with previous decades, meaning salaries still rise but not always in proportion to total output growth. Inflation then magnifies this effect because households experience prices immediately, while structural income adjustments happen much more slowly. Food prices illustrate this clearly. A salary may rise annually, but food prices can respond within weeks to fuel costs, weather disruptions, shipping delays, or currency movements. When a household sees frequent price changes in groceries, that becomes a daily reminder that wages feel behind. Energy prices create similar pressure because they influence transport, heating, electricity, and production costs simultaneously. Even when central inflation numbers begin slowing, households may continue feeling pressure because some visible categories remain expensive for longer. This creates a perception that salaries never truly recover, even when statistical wage growth improves. Another reason salary growth feels permanently delayed is debt at the household level. In many economies, workers now allocate large portions of income to mortgages, rent, education loans, credit payments, or transport financing. This means salary increases often disappear into obligations created years earlier. A raise that might once have improved disposable income now simply offsets rising repayments or interest costs. In environments where interest rates rise, this effect becomes stronger because borrowing becomes more expensive, precisely when households hope salary increases will improve financial comfort. The result is that workers do receive more money over time, but much of that increase is already committed before it reaches daily spending decisions. This explains why even middle-income earners often describe feeling financially static despite long-term salary progression. On paper, wages rise, but financially they feel trapped between inflation, debt, and recurring costs. Governments sometimes respond by raising minimum wages or adjusting public sector salaries, but these interventions also face limits. If wages rise too sharply without matching productivity, businesses may pass costs into prices, which can create additional inflation pressure. This is why wage policy often moves cautiously, even when living costs rise quickly. Economists constantly debate this balance because too little wage growth weakens purchasing power, but too rapid wage growth can also create inflation risks if productivity does not support it. The system therefore moves in gradual adjustments, which is exactly why households often feel that salaries are always reacting rather than leading. By the time income catches one problem, another cost has already appeared. That repeated lag is what creates the widespread feeling that salaries never truly move ahead of life itself. Once all of these forces are viewed together, a larger realization begins to appear. Salaries are not failing because one single institution is making the wrong decision, but because modern economies are balancing many competing pressures at the same time. Employers try to control costs while remaining competitive. Governments try to protect purchasing power without accelerating inflation. Central banks try to stabilize prices without damaging employment. And global markets constantly reshape how value is distributed across industries. The worker standing inside the system experiences only the visible result. Income rises, but life still feels expensive. Yet beneath that visible result lies an economic design where wages move cautiously because every adjustment affects multiple parts of the system. This explains why salary growth often feels permanently delayed rather than permanently absent. Over long periods, wages do rise, but they rarely rise in a smooth way that households immediately experience as relief. Instead, income catches one pressure while another develops. Housing expands faster than wages in one decade, energy rises in another, inflation accelerates unexpectedly in another, and tax structures shift in ways that change take-home pay without always being obvious. What people describe as salary frustration is often the lived experience of several economic mechanisms operating together. Historical wage studies show that across long time horizons, incomes have increased significantly compared with earlier generations, but expectations have also changed because essential costs now occupy a larger and more visible share of monthly budgets. Housing in major cities, healthcare in some economies, childcare, transport, and digital services all shape what income feels like in practical terms. A salary that once would have represented comfort may now feel ordinary because essential categories consume more of it before discretionary spending even begins. Another key realization is that wages are often designed to remain stable rather than dramatically flexible. Stability helps businesses plan, helps contracts remain predictable, and reduces sudden disruptions in labor markets. But that same stability means salaries react slowly when conditions change quickly. Inflation can move within months, supply disruptions can raise prices rapidly, and housing markets can shift faster than payroll structures. This built-in slowness protects the broader economy from sudden wage shocks, but for households, it creates the feeling of permanent catch-up. Even during strong economic years, many workers feel they are only recovering ground that was already lost earlier. International labor studies repeatedly show that real wage recovery often occurs after inflation peaks rather than during it, meaning households experience pressure first and improvement later. By the time wages begin improving, financial confidence has often already been weakened. This explains why public sentiment about wages can remain negative even when official wage growth becomes positive again. People remember the months or years when prices move faster than income, and that memory shapes how every future raise is perceived. There's also a deeper social dimension to why salaries feel insufficient. In modern economies, income is increasingly compared not only to survival, but to access to home ownership, education, mobility, security, and future planning. If salaries rise, but access to these goals becomes harder, workers still feel left behind. A person may earn more than previous generations in nominal terms, yet feel financially weaker because buying a home takes longer, saving takes more discipline, and future uncertainty feels greater. This changes the emotional meaning of salary itself. Income is no longer judged only by current comfort, but by whether it creates long-term possibility. When long-term goals become harder, even rising salaries feel incomplete. That is why discussions about wages often become discussions about fairness, opportunity, and whether economic growth is reaching households in meaningful ways. And this is where the hidden reason behind salary frustration becomes clearest. Salaries do rise, but they rise inside a system where multiple powerful forces constantly absorb part of that increase before households fully feel it. Inflation reduces purchasing power, housing absorbs income, taxes reshape take-home pay, debt consumes future earnings, and cautious wage structures delay recovery. The result is not that salaries never move, but that they often move within limits designed by a much larger economic balance. The next time someone receives a raise yet still feels financially unchanged, the explanation may not be personal at all. It may be the visible outcome of inflation timing, labor market structure, productivity distribution, global competition, and the economic choices made far beyond any single workplace. Once that becomes clear, the question changes. Instead of asking why salaries never catch up, it becomes more accurate to ask what they are trying to catch up with. Because in modern economies, wages are not chasing one fixed target. They are chasing a moving system where prices, productivity, policy, and global competition keep shifting at the same time. And that is why, for so many people around the world, salary growth can feel real on paper yet incomplete in everyday life.